Greetings and welcome back to the second mini lecture on Britain, and this one is entitled The House of Commons, a Reactive Legislature. You may remember that when I talked about the US Congress, I called it an active legislature. So that's your obvious major compare and contrast. An active US Congress versus a reactive British House of Commons, and I'll talk a bit more about what that means later on in the mini lecture. Now, in Britain, the largest party is typically Her Majesty's government, unless there is a rare coalition government, and there have been two of them since World War II. The other party is called the Opposition Party. So, obviously, right now, we have the Conservatives, who are the government, led by Prime Minister Johnson, and the Opposition Party is Labor. If you look at your notes, I start with the size of the House of Commons, and this is very different than the U.S. Congress. I pointed that out in the notes. The House of Representatives has had 435 members for a century. The U.S. Senate has had 100 senators since Alaska and Hawaii joined the Union. But in Great Britain, the size of the House of Commons has varied dramatically. I pointed out that from 1801 to 1885, it was 658. It was increased to 670, 1885 to 1918. In 1918, it was enlarged to 707, which is as large as the House of Commons has been over the last 200 years. It has been as small as 625 in 1950. If I were to ask you about the House of Commons today, the House of Commons has 650 members, 651 if you include the Speaker, and I don't because the Speaker is a neutral actor, and I'll talk about what that means later. The size has even changed frequently in recent years. So if we look at the last 20 years, for example, the size of the Commons was 659 in 2001, 646 in 2005, and it has been 650 since 2010. My guess is in the next decade, the Boundary Commission, which changes the size of the Commons on occasion, will probably change the size of the Commons again, but for right now, there are 650 members. I made a few comments that are testworthy in this section, and one is that in Great Britain there are more competitive seats in the House of Commons than there is in the U.S. Congress. I pointed out earlier when I talked about the Congress that 92% of House members seeking re-election since World War II have won. It's almost 80% in the Senate. In the House of Commons, in a typical election, and of course every election varies a bit, but kind of the rule of thumb in Britain is about 450 out of 650 seats are safe. And I will ask a question in Britain about how many seats are considered safe. 450. Now, the other way to look at that is there are 200 competitive seats in each and every election in Great Britain. That is a large number. It is almost a third. It is about 30% of seats are open, are competitive, are up for grabs. And this is significant because I pointed out a couple of things that I think are very, very different about the British system. The first is in Britain, I do believe that the rule of anticipated reactions is far greater in the minds of members of Parliament than American congresspersons. In your notes, I've defined the rule of anticipated reactions as fear of electoral punishment. In the United States, there are a few competitive seats, but not very, very many. And most Congress people understand that they're going to be reelected, that they have huge advantages in fundraising and name recognition, and in a whole variety of ways. In Britain, electoral success is far more challenging, and a lot more incumbents get beat. And so I think it makes British policymakers very, very conscious of public opinion because the public may throw them out of office. And I think what this means for voters in Britain is something very different than in the United States. In Britain, there really is what I call responsible party government. And responsible party government is exactly what its name implies, that voting for a party has clear policy consequences. So if you are a voter in Britain, you have a lot more political efficacy than you do as a voter in the United States, because in Britain, the system is geared towards getting things done. Since World War II, 97%, a little bit less, it's 96.6 technically, but I'm rounding up. 97% of the legislation that's proposed by the Prime Minister in the cabinet is implemented into law. So as a voter, you understand that if you vote for a party and they tell you that if you vote us into office, we're going to get you A, B, and C, with 97% certainty that's going to happen. In the United States, that never happens. Whether you are a Democrat or a Republican, your party is not going to be able to deliver on 97% of their promises. In fact, a lot of political commentators say that if a president can get his way a third of the time, one third in domestic policy, that's an effective president. So contrast that. A third is seen as successful in the United States. The worst prime minister, the worst since World War II, got 90.6% of their legislation passed while they were prime minister. So in Britain, 90.6% is abject failure. There is another huge difference between the House of Commons and the Congress. In the U.S. Congress, we have fixed calendar elections, right? We know in November, every 2 years, all 435 House members are going to be up for re-election. We know that a third of the Senate is going to be up for re-election. In Britain, there has to be an election every 5 years, so you should know that there has to be an election at least every 5 years. But prime ministers can and often do call for elections early if they think that it may help them on election day. And so take a look at your notes. And I started with 1979. And then Margaret Thatcher, when the Falklands War broke out, called for elections a year early in 1983. So there was an election after 4 years, not 5. She then called for elections early again in 1987. Again, after 4 years, not 5. Then in 1992, okay, 5 years went by, there was an election. 1997, once again, 5 years, and then there was an election. And then Tony Blair called for elections early in 2001, so it was 4 years instead of 5. Called for elections early again in 2005, once again 4 years instead of 5. Then there were elections in 2010 and 15, which is normal, 5 years, general election. But take a look at what's happened lately. There was an election in 2015, and then an election 2 years later in 2017. And an election 2 years later in 2019. We've even had years in which there has been 2 elections in 1 year, although that has not happened since the early 1970s. So in the United States, we have fixed calendar elections. In Britain, elections vary, but they have to occur at least every 5 years. The second overview is that the prime minister must be able to count on the majority of the House of Commons to stay in power. If the prime minister loses the support of a majority of the House of Commons, they're either going to resign, or the House of Commons can actually vote to remove them. And I called that a vote of no confidence. This last occurred in 19 1979, Margaret Thatcher was able to maneuver the House of Commons to vote no confidence in Prime Minister Callaghan. And that's the last time that there was a formal vote of no confidence. But notice that I put in the notes that in the last 30 years, that is not very long, in the last 30 years, since 1990, Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair, David Cameron, and Theresa May, 4 prime ministers have resigned under pressure from her party. Notice the contrast with the impeachment process. In theory, the Congress can also remove a president through the impeachment process. But the impeachment process mandates that a president can be removed if he is guilty of high crimes and misdemeanors, whatever that happens to be. In Britain, there is no justification needed to get rid of a British prime minister. Usually, if the House of Commons believes that their leader, the prime minister, is an electoral liability, they will pressure them to resign. And usually this comes from their own party. So certainly it is intriguing. The only 2 prime ministers in the last 100 years to win 3 consecutive elections was Margaret Thatcher, a conservative, Tony Blair, a Labourite, and yet the success story of their parties, both of them were eventually pressured to resign from office by their party leaders. So this is a very intriguing power. It is a power really of the party more than the Commons in this particular case. But it means that, and I'll talk more about this when I get to prime ministers versus presidents in the next module, but it means that, on the one hand, the prime minister looks very powerful. There are no term limits. In theory, they can be there forever. Usually their party passes their legislation very, very loyally. But of course, prime ministers can be ousted by the people in a general election. Obviously, that's true of presidents. But prime ministers can also be pressured to resign by their party. Presidents don't have to worry about that. Even if a president is getting people angry in their own party, they can't pressure them to resign. And the Congress can't just say, we've lost confidence in you, Mr. President, you have to step down. The Congress has to make the case that the president is actually guilty of something. In this case, high crimes and misdemeanors. So being prime minister certainly has some significant advantages over the U.S. president. Not having term limits is one. Being able to call for elections early is another. Having the tremendous loyalty in your party to pass your legislation, very, very good. But the cost is that you have to keep the people happy. You have to keep the party leaders happy. And you have to keep the Parliament, the House of Commons, happy. Because any of those 3 can force you from office. And so while the American president doesn't have the job security in the sense that presidents are limited to 2 terms in office, presidents have to deal with a system of separation of powers and checks and balances to where their legislation, it's much more difficult to get legislation passed. Presidents don't have to rely on party leaders. They don't have to fear party leaders pressuring a resignation. They don't have to fear the Congress ousting them from office. So there are pros and there are cons, and I'll go into a lot of details on that. In the last mini lecture, I'll talk about the tasks and functions of the House of Commons. I'll talk about how and why it's a reactive legislature, and I'll give you some concluding comments. So I will finish up the House of Commons in the next mini lecture. Hope you are having a great week, everyone.